here's the, well, actually, let me just, this is the lesson that I was going to talk about anyway, so I'll just talk about it now. When you're conducting an experiment, you can't make your specific topic of interest obvious to the people who are being studied. In the case of the Hawthorne effect, they knew that their productivity was being measured, so they behaved accordingly. They just increased their productivity no matter what. So this is one of the tricky things about conducting an experiment. You don't want your specific topic of interest to be obvious to the people who are being studied, but at the same time, you can't study people without telling people that they're being studied. That's unethical, and I'll talk about some examples of that in a moment. But so if you're doing a social science experiment, people know they're being studied in a social science experiment. You may have seen actually right next to our classroom, well, our former classroom, there's a social science research lab where students volunteer to participate in experiments. Those people obviously know they're participating in an experiment, but you have to design your experiment as the researcher in such a way that people don't know the specific thing that's being studied. They're just participating in an experiment. And so you have to design it in such a way that people know they're being studied, but they don't know what specifically is being studied. Like, for example, a social science experiment might be about, how do people's attitudes about race influence or cause them to behave differently in particular situations, or something like that. But you don't want people to be able to figure out while they're doing the experiment. You don't want them to figure out like, oh, this experiment is trying to determine my attitudes about race, and I don't want to seem like a racist. So I'm gonna change change how I would behave normally, or I'm gonna change how I would behave normally. So you got to kind of, it's a subtle art doing social science experiments, because you don't want people to actually be able to figure out what's being studied. In terms of this thing that the second bullet point that I've underlined about it being unethical to study people without telling them they're being studied, there are a lot of multiple examples of medical experimentation on African Americans in American history. Not hundreds and hundreds of years ago, like less than 100 years ago, where people were studied without being told, and this is some pretty shameful stuff in American history. There's the Tuskegee experiments. This is where African Americans were infected with syphilis and then not told that they had syphilis, and not given the cure once the penicillin was developed and could cure syphilis. They were not given the treatment because researchers wanted to know, okay, what are the effects of syphilis untreated for decades on people? That's a shameful. Ultimately, I think it was Bill Clinton. You can go to this link that gives. I think there's a timeline here, right? So this is. Anyway, you can see this timeline on this is all first half of the 20th century, and it's not until 1997 when President Clinton apologizes on behalf of the nation. This is something that was done in Tuskegee, Alabama. That's why it's called the Tuskegee study or experiments. Henrietta Lacks, you may have heard of Henrietta Lacks. There was a movie made based on a book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, just within the last 5 to 10 years. Right, I guess 10 years. The book was published in 2010, and then the movie came out a few years later. This also has a Baltimore connection, where Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman who was treated for some sort of cancer. This was at Johns Hopkins, I believe, in Baltimore. And so her cancer cells there was something about them. I think they just reproduced at a really fast rate. So they scraped some of her cancer cells out of her body, and then unbeknownst to her or her family, those cells they kept reproducing, and then so the cells that reproduced from the first cells that were taken from her body, those cells were sold around the world to medical researchers studying cancer treatments. And Henrietta Lacks never knew this. Her family never knew it until, later, much later. And significantly, the sales of those cells generated massive amounts of money for Johns Hopkins and others. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given the fact that she was never informed that any of this happened, she was never, nor was her family ever given any of the massive amount of money that was generated from literally from within her body. So that's just another kind of shameful example of the the unethical way or the lack of ethics of not telling someone that they're being studied. Okay. All right. That's it for today. I'm going to check. I'm really hoping that this recorded successfully. If you have any questions about any of this, do not hesitate to email me. And okay, I'll have another such. Assuming this works out okay, I'll have another similar lecture posted on Tuesday. All right. Stay safe, everybody, and have a good weekend.